Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. Today we have a returning guest on Daniel Coston. He's been here before with discussions about the Beach Boys, the Left Bank, Circle. We had the whole Circle group on another episode here, and this time he's coming back to talk about the Beckies. What? But it is in relation, I've discovered, to the Left Bank. And
Mhm.
so we will be discussing the Beckies, and hopefully we will make you a Beckian or a Beck,
Baguette, yeah,
Becky
not a
mania.
baguette, but something thereabout. So yeah, but yes, it does have a number of left bank ties, and Court of the Left Bank, of course, filters through the making of this reissue. So the Beckies was, essentially the last major label project of Michael Brown, main writer of the Left Bank.
Okay.
And so what happened was Michael, after two records with Stories, leaves Stories in '74, starts working again with Scott Trusty, with whom he'd done a single in 1970, Quarter
Hmm.
Horses. And Scott recommended two friends who just were moving up from Kansas City, Gary Hodgson, later Gary West,
Okay.
and Jimmy McAllister.
Hmm.
And they demoed lots and lots. And throughout 1974, 1975, and Jimmy, when I met him many years later, was like, "Oh, you've got to hear these demos. These demos are they're as good, if not better, than the record." And I always felt that. I've had these demos in my collection for 20 years.
Hmm.
They keep working through '75. They get a demo. They get an audition with Mercury Records. Mercury doesn't take them, but they have some really nice studio recordings of these songs, which they then work out a deal with Sire. They
Hmm.
start recording with Sire early 1976. The album comes out in June, but there's a number of issues even by that point. Michael's not going to tour. So originally the group was going to be called Brown's Band. They had a logo designed and everything. And once that wasn't going to happen, they kind of defaulted to the Beckies, which was the name of one of the wives of members of one of the members of the band. I think it was Gary's.
Okay.
And they released the record in '76. They do one live show at a record convention in New York without Michael. And the record pretty much dies on the vine. Sire really didn't want to get behind it. It was almost at this point they and the band had kind of moved on by the time the record was released.
Hmm.
And I always liked the record, but I also felt like the record never really got a proper push, and B, never had a proper mastering. To me, the if you listen to even the remastered version that was released 10 years ago, sounds muddy. It sounds a
Okay.
little underwater.
Hmm.
And so what how this reissue came to be is, as some of y'all will know, that I've been working on the Left Bank archives the last few years. We released a release of the Left Bank's third album, Strangers on a Train. We did that through Omnivore in 2022. Included were some bonus tracks that Michael had done with the other Left Bank members in 2001, 2002. I subsequently, working on that project, found the rest of those recordings from that era, try to get those released, have not been able to due to some issues that have to be worked out between the estate and the label. And I said, okay, well, let me do the Beckies. And I presented the demos, got in touch with all the surviving band members, got them all to sign on. And then, to their credit, Omnivore came back and said, okay, you do the liner notes, you do everything, we'll go with this. And so I did the liner notes for this reissue, got a lot of information that's never been public knowledge before about the band. And Michael Graves did an amazing job on the remastering, not just for the demos, but the album. He went back and remastered the whole album. And to my ears, it finally sounds right
Hmm.
after all these years. It just, they sent it to me, and I was listening to the first track here in my office and working on stuff around. I was like, I had to stop halfway through the first song. I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I've been wanting all along. So
Yeah.
I'm really proud of it. It will be out February 28th through Omnivore Recordings. And it's a two-disc set. You can also just buy the demos by themselves. The other thing I would note about the demos is that most of these songs on the demos have never been heard. What happened was when the Beckies formed, Michael was writing songs with Scott Trusty. Michael and Scott collaborated a lot of things. As they got closer to the Sire record deal, Michael switched to writing with Gary West.
Hmm.
And I think there was some discussions with folks who were managing Michael at that point who said, no, you really should go through just working with Gary. So all of Scott's songs were pushed out, even though majority of them are on. They're on all the demos. They're on the Mercury studio demos, and so now you really get to hear the entire progression of the Beckies from beginning to the Sire album.
Hmm.
And I also will mention too, this is for me a couple of important things. One, this is a bookend. Michael and the Left Banke come out with Walk Away Renee in 1966. 10 years later, he bookends that with the Beckies. And he essentially, after that, says, I'm done with major labels, retreats to New Jersey, and spends, the rest of his life writing songs, eventually raising a family, and never really put himself out in the public eye after the Beckies. So this is an important mark for me, but it's an important chapter of the related Left Banke and related story that has never really been properly told. So I really think now I'm glad that the Beckies are getting to find their own footing, if you will, and also let the songs tell the story. Let the songs speak for themselves.
Hmm. All that raised about 20 questions, so let me kind of go through
I,
them.
I'm good.
Uh,
I'm good about that. Yeah. Hi. Here's the answers. Here's way more questions. Yeah.
yeah. You mentioned, see, I tried to keep track of all this while you were saying it. So they only did one performance ever?
Yes.
And
Ever.
when was that, and what was the details again?
It was a record convention in New York City. We pinpointed it as June 1976, and Michael wouldn't play, so they had
Yeah,
a
that
friend
was
that
my
played
next question is
keyboards.
why didn't he participate?
He was still, again, there were some issues, things that happened during Michael's time with the Left Banke, and particularly a really dangerous plane ride in a small plane that basically kind of much like Brian Wilson, Michael didn't want to play live again.
Hmm.
Although we did discover in the process of putting this record together that 2 years after the Beckies, he did do some live appearances. He actually Jimmy McAllister was doing some backing for another artist, and Michael was going through some more things after that, and his therapist, I think, convinced him that, oh, like playing live would be good for you. So after all this, like 10 years of not playing live, Michael plays very low key. I'm blanking on it. So last Lisa Burns, that's it. And I actually got Lisa. It's not in this booklet, but I actually found Lisa and got her to talk about having Michael in the band. And he was basically he. It's also the only time that Michael played songs that he did not write on
Hmm.
stage. It's a really interesting story.
Hmm.
But this point, 76, June 76, Michael still's not playing live. So they got a friend of theirs to play keyboards. At this point, Gary had decided he wanted to be a front man as well, even though he's drummer and co-vocalist on the record. So
Hmm.
he's playing guitar and singing at this record convention. And a friend of theirs from a band called the Marbles plays drums. And they what did Scott Trusty tell me? He said we thought it sounded like a mess, but we heard it sounded pretty good.
Hmm.
And that was about it. That was the only live appearance they did, and I think that was part of the reason why Sire didn't get behind them. But also, um, Sire released a lot of good records in the mid to late '70s, but a lot of them they did not get behind. It's almost like they were waiting for. It's like this old record company thing where you go, okay, well, if it's doing something on its own, then we'll get behind it.
Yeah.
That's kind of what happened with the Left Banke. The Left
Yeah.
Banke was released, Smash Mercury. They thought that record was dead.
Hmm.
It wasn't until somebody in the Midwest started playing it a few months after its release that it started becoming something.
Hmm.
So yeah, so only one live appearance. I'm not been. I believe I put it down to late June,
Okay.
'76, and I'm hoping to find some more information about that.
Now, apart from Michael, did any of the others perform again live, either solo or part of other bands or anything in the succeeding years? So they had normal kind of careers or what, you know?
Somewhat,
I mean,
Jimmy McAllister. One of the first things he did after the Beckies breakup was he became a guitarist for Sparks. He
oh,
actually
okay.
recruited
All
them
right.
as
Yeah.
second guitarist in much
Thought
of
I heard of him before.
'76. Yeah,
Yeah.
Jimmy played with a number of bands through the
Okay.
years. Gary went on to his own solo career, mostly in the country field,
Okay.
and I'm blanking on the band that he had. But again, if you look up Gary West, you'll find he was a very successful singer and songwriter.
Okay.
Scott Trusty and the uncredited bassist for the Becky's record, Mark Abel.
Hmm.
They had a band of their own called Passengers,
Okay.
and unfortunately, that band was never able to record. I should mention too that Mark is now a very successful conductor and musician. You'll find if you look his Wikipedia page, it's kind of amazing. But Mark was the bassist and vocalist on all these recordings by the Beckies. He was not credited because he was already a member of the band called City Lights, which
Hmm.
had released their own album on Sire in 1975. Which actually, he was one of the folks that helped get the Beckies to deal with Sire.
Okay. So Scott, Gary, and Mark are the only surviving members at this point.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Scott is in New Mexico, I believe,
Hmm.
and I have really, when I first approached Scott, obviously, understandably, he had was wary of anybody who says, "Hey, I want to release your album from '76." But he is,
Yeah.
to his credit, he saw that I really believed in the project, and
Hmm.
now he and Mark are both have made themselves available to do interviews
Okay.
for this record, which they've never done.
Yeah.
Which is really, really, I will allow myself and say I did good on that one. And
Um,
yeah,
any
and
of
I
them go to the step further, like, like it happened with the Circle, where at least one member's there and like get a new Becky's group together to kind of tour, or is this just kind of like a one and done thing? And yeah, we'll
think
talk about it, but or this is it.
it's kind of a one and done
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
Gary is doing okay. He's not playing live. He's somewhat retired now from music.
Yeah.
So everybody has their own thing. But also, I should mention that Michael's family and Jimmy's family have been very supportive
Okay.
in putting this project together.
Okay. Now, going back to originally when they originally got together. So, and it kind of ties into the live thing too. So, Michael all along wouldn't have toured with them
I don't know.
even if they became a success. It probably wouldn't have happened, at least at that time. Yeah,
Well, it's
okay.
one of the reasons why Stories didn't tour as much. They didn't. I
Yeah.
think they did some limited engagements or maybe did some record company showcases, but they didn't really tour.
Yeah.
That's why you really don't see any TV appearances of them until after Brother Louie hits, because at this point Michael's out of the band.
Right.
And it was something that I think some of it was, well, Michael saw, well, Brian doesn't have to tour.
Yeah.
I don't want to tour. But Michael was very dedicated to his music,
Yeah.
and he was much happier being at home writing these songs, which sustained his entire life.
Yeah. I guess the Beatles kind of paved the way that you could actually have a career back in the 70s at least, and never tour. I mean, Harry Nilsson, I don't think ever toured, and he had a lot of hit records. So, you know,
I think Baker Street. Oh gosh,
oh, Jerry Rafferty.
Rafferty. He
Yeah.
only did one tour,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was very. I mean, he did some early touring with the Humble Bums and
Yeah.
Steelers Wheel, but no, like when he became Jerry Rafferty, he only did one tour. He was
Wow.
very adamant about
And
not touring. There are some musicians that are like that,
yeah.
and when I think what happens too is you have a blush of success, you go out and do these things, and then things happen. Maybe it's just as sustainable as it once appeared, and you just go, I don't want to do this anymore. And I think
Yeah.
Michael felt like that,
Yeah.
and I think Michael was very happy to. He would love being in the process of being in a band and creating the music. He not didn't always necessarily want to deal with the things you have to do to sustain a band.
Hmm. Now, shifting a little bit to their label, um, do you know the history of Sire Records pretty well? Because I mean, obviously later on they became a very successful label and having Madonna on their label and Talking Heads and quite a few others and a lot of new wave artists and things like that. But in the 70s, it seemed like they were kind of almost as obscure as Rhino Records in that they did they managed to put out a Turtles record after the Flo and Eddie got the masters to him. And so that's what I'm thinking of
Mhm.
with this too. It's like a similar kind of back catalog type thing, even though they're doing a new record. Is that how Sire was? If you know the origins, if you can kind of briefly cover that, just between then and then how they became in the 80s.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
This was, Sire is the brainchild of Seymour Stein, and
Hmm.
Seymour was the one who actually signed the Beckies as well through
Hmm.
the recommendations of Mark. And even Mark said, Seymour would sign a lot of things, but it didn't mean they always would get behind it. It was very much, and that's how a lot of record labels were. It was like, hey, we'll sign you and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But thankfully, the good side of that is that a lot of bands that we wouldn't have been able to hear otherwise did get signed, did were able to release an album or more, or single or two. So, but yeah, I think it was like a lot of record labels in the 70s. It was just like, okay, we'll sign them. They've got some pedigree. See what happens. Oh, okay, well, they're not going to tour and these other things happening. Then by the summer of '76, you know, trends were changing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think the Beckies got caught up in a little bit of that too.
Yeah.
So I think Sire in some ways was a good label for them at the time, but it wasn't the label that was going to help try to push them
Right.
further.
Now, how did like Talking Heads work? Did they just take it upon themselves to tour regardless of Cyrus Push? Is that how they kind of
There was some, well, I
made
think
it? Yeah.
Talking Heads had that, New York scene. They had a buzz, they had a following, but
Okay.
you know, Talking Heads were going to go out and make it happen.
Right.
They were going to go out. Okay, you want us to tour? Fine. They're going to, and they did for a number
Okay.
of years.
Right.
So, but Michael and the Beckies was a different situation.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. You may have seen this documentary about Beatles Apple Records. It came out probably about 20 years ago. Has a lot of interviews with Jackie Lomax and everything like that. But the one thing that I didn't think about, but I rewatched it yesterday just because I rewatch the documentaries every so often and I always
Mhm,
get a little morsel out of something. But it applies to this is basically because the Beatles weren't touring anymore, they didn't put money or energy or anything or effort behind tours for any of their artists. If
mhm,
if anybody toured, like say George Harrison toured, he just did because he felt like it. It wasn't because somebody was telling him to do it.
right.
And certainly Badfinger was probably the biggest group. Apple wasn't putting up money for that. I guess they were touring on their own, you
They were,
know.
and
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
I think all the Apple artists dealt with that. It
yeah,
was like, the Beatles were very comfortable. We're stars almost, even though we're not doing this game, but
yeah,
that didn't always apply to their other artists, and
yeah,
it's why a lot of their artists didn't stay for very long. Because
yeah,
yes, they made great albums, but there was nothing. Okay, we put the album out. Now
yeah,
what? In the
yeah,
Beatles case, they knew it was going to sell millions of copies,
yeah,
or you'd have something like Mary Hopkin who sells you know tons of records with Postcard, and
mhm,
those are the days. But
mhm,
then that's it's not sustainable the way it
yeah.
was for the Beatles.
Yeah. So I guess in thinking about that, I guess what Sire was doing wasn't necessarily that out of the ordinary. I mean, now it kind of seems kind of shocking because
Mhm.
especially in light of that if you don't tour now, you're pretty much dead in your career. You really
Mhm.
need to tour. Like Taylor Swift in traditional times, as she was around in the 70s, probably wouldn't even have to tour. She'd just put out an album and it would be a success and that would be it. But now
Mhm.
she has to tour and the albums are kind of secondary. Granted, hers actually chart well, but that doesn't happen with everyone else. It's like if you want to keep the money rolling in, you got to keep out on the road nowadays. It's just kind of a shock, you know.
Yeah.
So,
And even in the 1990s, when there was that kind of that last, record label, era of, okay, we're going to sign, this whole these sounds are happening. We're going to sign any band we can, and then we'll see what happens. They were still expected to tour.
right.
If you were on Elektra, your album may not get much push, but you were still going to tour nationally for several weeks, if
Yeah.
only because they wanted to see, okay, is this record happening? Where is this record happening? Where is the single happening?
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's different times and places.
Yeah.
What can you say?
Yeah. Now, another thing about promoting, so it looks like on the Beckies album when it came out, there's only one single off of it, which is River Bayou backed with song called Love.
Yes.
And both were album tracks. So there, it's sometimes when some label would get behind a record, they would like put out two or three different singles, just saying, well, maybe if the soft rock version doesn't fly, let's do the harder rocking version or something, or song or whatever. Yet they only put out the one song. Now I listened to it right before we went on River Bayou. It's a nice song. It actually has, for me, a kind of a 50s feel with
Hmm.
kind of 70s touches to it. At least that
Right.
song. I don't know about the whole album. I'll have to listen to the whole album, but
Yeah.
I'll
No.
get to that in a moment. But was that the best track for a single, and why didn't they try anything else?
To my ears, no. And actually, what you were listening to is the demo. That is the Mercury demo of that. The
Hmm.
studio version is different, a little better, but has some. I look forward to everybody listening to the differences on February 28th.
Yes.
Um, but I have very, gosh, Fran, off the Becky's album, the first song, Right by Your Side. I love that. And I should mention that is the one appearance of Tom Finn, former Left Banke bassist and harmony vocalist. He does the harmonies on that song.
Hmm.
The morning that she came. There was three, from my ears, there were three, four really good singles, but that tells you a lot.
Yeah.
They said, okay, that sounds like a decent song. We'll push that. Okay, and apparently it did get some airplay.
Okay.
There was some brief, okay, hey, you're getting some airplay. How would you feel about a tour of England? But all that died pretty quickly.
Mhm. But they never pressed up any other singles, even in other countries, other than the
No,
one. It's kind of
no.
interesting when they do that.
Yes, it is. I mean,
Yeah.
I would in most other cases you would have found, okay, well, not going back to your point with the circle, they were still releasing singles through Columbia even after they broken up. And if you
Yeah.
can't find them in the U.S., you find them in Canada.
Hmm.
You find them other cities. But yeah, I think pretty much with the Beckies, what we have found is what they did.
Hmm. And do you see anything that would have made Sire react negatively to the group, or did they just kind of have a general apathy towards promoting him?
It's a mixture of things. I think they had spent to Sire's. Um, I'm trying to figure out their perspective. I think because the process of recording and signing and getting recorded took so long, I think not only was the label kind of emotionally they'd moved on, I think to a certain degree the band had moved on, which is
Mm,
really unfortunate. I think the process of working and working and working and trying to get these songs and then finally getting, I know that the recording itself was somewhat of a difficult process because Michael's largely producing the record himself. I
mhm,
should mention here that there was a brief discussion of having John Abbott, who was the original Left Banke arranger, co-produce the album, and that fell apart, um, fortunately rather quickly. And Michael pretty much oversaw the record. There's another name that's credited on the album, but according to the band members, that guy only kind of got involved after the basic tracking was done.
mhm,
So I think there was, yeah, that combine all that in 19, summer of 1976.
mhm,
I think just a lot of it was just easier for a lot of people. Just okay, well, we did that. Let's move on,
mm,
which is
okay.
unfortunate because it's a really good record, and
Mhm,
I'm that again going back to the amazing the remastering that is on both of these discs. I think you really hear like, no, this is a really good band. These are
mhm.
really good songs, and it's a really I'm slightly biased, but I think it's a really fascinating story.
Right.
And I've worked with a lot of artists that somehow create really great work almost completely in spite of the circumstances around them or the circumstances of themselves.
Yeah.
So I think you hear a lot of that on this
Yeah.
record.
Well, it seems like I don't know which decade the most, but it seems like the 70s was the decade where there was a lot of stuff that was good, that just kind of didn't make it for whatever reason. I mean, I saw a documentary, and you probably have seen this one too, about that all-girl group called Fanny,
Yes.
and then they
Yeah.
reissued everything, and their stuff is pretty decent. They did a couple TV specials. They kept trying. They put out four albums at least, but it was just the fact that they kept trying and it's still kind of, you know.
Well, I'll give another case in point is this record by a guy named Dane Donahue. Dane
Hmm.
Donahue did this amazing, which now it would be put in with the yacht rock genre,
Hmm.
but his album in Columbia has basically three members of the Eagles, several members of Toto, Stevie Nicks,
Hmm.
Steve Gadd, Jay Graydon. I mean, it's like you look at this is like the yacht rock superstars all on his album.
The yacht rock superstar. Anyway.
Mhm, yes, but no, like KTEL's not around, but it would be if you could if the KTEL was still here.
Right.
It's a fantastic record,
Hmm.
and but it was Dane's second attempt at making a record, and by the time Columbia was ready to release it, Columbia had moved on.
Yeah.
There were some other issues, I think, with Dane's management that didn't help.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was a lot of times it was easier for a major label to just say, okay, fine, let it die in the vine,
Hmm.
unless the miracle of miracles happens and some radio station picks it up and it takes off.
Right.
Um,
I'm thinking of the zombies there, or
yeah,
Sheriff years later, is an example, so yeah.
exactly. It's like at which point the label's almost like, yay, we succeeded. You got the million to one shot,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great music from the 70s, but it doesn't
Yeah.
always mean that the labels were willing to give those records their full due
Yeah.
once they were
Y-
released.
I don't know if this exists. I wouldn't be the one to host this because I wouldn't know, but I would love for someone. I mean, I guess our friend Andrew Sandoval kind of does it, but he kind of sticks with the late 60s stuff. But
Yeah,
putting out like a weekly show about, groups that should have made it and didn't, so they'd have the Beckies on an episode, they'd have all these people we're talking about on an episode, give a brief history and play the songs because it's like, okay, so they didn't survive, they didn't make it in the 70s, but here in the 21st century when we have access to everything on the internet, you
yeah,
know, here's
yeah.
some things to look for on YouTube or on Spotify or whatever, it's like, yeah,
And when we were coming up, it was you were lucky if you had that friend or knew somebody at a record store and said, "Oh my, if you're into this, you would really like this."
yeah.
Have you heard this? Have you heard Big Star? I'll give you a tape of
Yeah.
it.
I
It's
used to I used to go by friends' recommendations all the time. I used to look at when I'd go to Tower Records, it's like our staff recommends these records and I'd always look at them and I'd say, oh, okay, all right. Because I wanted to hear I was and I still think this to this day is there's some missing morsel. The Beckies might be one of them, you know, that there's some missing morsel of good music out there that I just have not grasped onto because of just sheer ignorance of it. It's like, yeah,
Or you just haven't had the chance to listen to it yet. I mean, how
yeah,
many millions know Simon and Garfunkel, but they don't know the Crying Shames, who
yeah.
made this astounding record in '67 on Columbia, alongside Simon and Garfunkel and the Circle and Paul Revere and the Raiders, Scratch in the Sky. Actually, yes, and I'll recommend all three of his Crying Shames albums.
Hmm.
Um, for various reasons, people haven't heard it yet. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean it's not any worse for wear. It just means you just haven't heard it yet.
Yep, yep. And that's why I appreciated Andrew Sandoval's. He turned me on to a lot of different groups that I either
Mhm.
thought, like say, I don't know, it comes to mind like the Four Seasons, oh, they were washed up in that late 60s period, it's like, no, they had some decent stuff, it's like, or just totally oblivious to it all completely. So,
Or
um,
things that like bands like Honey Bus or
right.
like but or something like the Move. We in America we didn't hear the Move singles, and then you hear the Move now or you hear their BBC live appearances. It's like, oh my God, this
Yeah.
band's amazing.
Yeah, about the
So
only song we knew was like "Do Ya," just because it was an ELO remake, So,
5 years
you know,
after the Move had broken up, yeah.
right, right. And then somewhere along the line, I got a single that has "My Marge" on it, and I go, "Oh, okay." And I forgot I think the other side actually was the A side, but I just remember the B side.
the the
You
move
know,
is like several bands in one. It's
you know,
just pick
you know.
pick any point, pick any moment where Roy Wood is going off on another tangent, and you're gonna find something cool, but it's still like yeah, like the
Yeah.
same guy that is doing a Cherry Blossom Clinic is then doing Brontosaurus, stuff
Hmm.
like that.
Okay. Going back to the Beckies, which we're trying to keep promoting this new album and stuff. So pretty much what this CD collection is that you're putting out at the end of February is pretty much everything they ever recorded, or is there some things that are just so that it doesn't make the cut?
Well, and I'm glad you brought this up because a few collectors will know that there were a few more songs on the Becky's demos that have a few more songs, and they're really good songs. And a couple of those songs have Tom Finn and the Left Bank on them.
Mm,
And I toyed with that notion, but I then played the songs to Scott Trusty, who again, Scott and Mark had never heard these demos after they've been recorded. They didn't know they still existed. And Scott was very adamant that that was those four songs, which Tom was a part of. I can even give you a couple titles: "The Whole World's Watching," "The Story," "Sunshine Bay."
mm,
They're great songs, but Scott said that's not us. That's not the Beckies.
mm,
So I think it was a post Sire album attempt with some members of the Beckies to kind of figure out what they wanted to do next. So I actually think those few songs is Michael Brown, Gary West, and I think Jimmy McAllister, but then does not have Scott and Mark
mm.
on
Okay.
them. Scott and Mark have no recollection of those recordings, and Scott was very adamant. Says these are not Becky songs, and
Okay.
I'm going to respect that.
Yeah.
I am going to say fine, but for the three other anoraks out there who have
Yeah.
heard the other Becky's demos, that's why they're not on this recording. But pretty much, we did want to say the complete collection.
Yeah.
There are a couple of songs that were better than others. So I think the Becky's story is a really good encapsulation of the story we're trying to tell
Mhm.
with this band from beginning to end.
Yeah. Of those outtakes, is there a chance those could see release under a different name, possibly, or under just Michael Brown, or like
It's
an
something I would like.
EP or something? You know.
We had a discussion with Omnivore some years ago, kind of doing a giant Left Bank odds and sods.
Mm,
But we also realized that a lot of those songs, a lot of them were collected by me or found by me through various sources. We don't know who owned them.
mm.
Trying to license them would just it'd be even more of a mess than trying to do a new version of Nuggets. But I've spoken to all the estates and said this is something I think you should consider down the road, even if you're just releasing it yourself. And some of them I think would be easier for the estates to take them on and say this is something that our family members did as opposed to something that a label would take on them. So
Right.
they are out. Some of those songs are out there. I think there's more.
Hmm.
I don't know if there's more Becky's. I don't think there's more Becky's,
Okay.
but I still have hope that there's still something out there in the Left Bank universe I have not heard yet.
Now, of what is being released on this to this set, when they did the Becky's album,
Mhm.
were those just taking the demos and enhancing them, or were they re-recordings, or a little of
New
both?
recordings. They were completely new recordings,
Okay.
and I would love to know if I don't think that was the demo, enhancing the demos was considered
Okay.
for a number of reasons. That would have been interesting to see what would have happened, knowing what we know now.
Yeah.
Um, it's a good question. But no, they were entirely new recordings,
Okay.
and again, it's like when this album was released in '76. I also I actually have had this issue with the first Left Bank record. The first Left Bank album really is mixed for AM radio, even though it's like that on the entire album.
Hmm.
It's almost bordering on lo-fi. There's no real high end. I will credit Andrew Sandoval and his 1994 reissue, or 1992 reissue of the Left Bank recordings as There's Going to Be a Storm was the first time that those songs, the Left Bank songs, got a sonic upgrade. Michael and his father had very much an ear for radio, and that was AM radio.
Yeah.
And I think there's some of that issue on a lot of Michael's recordings where he was also the producer.
Hmm.
That's just the way his ears were. It's not good. It's not bad. It just was. It really wasn't until I heard the remastering that Michael did, Michael of Omnivore, Michael Graves did, that I went, oh, this is the way it was supposed to sound all along. And I don't I'm not sure that that original mastering helped either in selling the record in 1976.
Hmm. Um, I'll go back to another question, but you said that a couple times. So this remastering is kind of like night and day almost, it sounds like, where, and I've heard that before, like another Beatle connect, everything's a Beatle connection with me. But
Mhm.
um
People have,
an
people have.
album I didn't care for, and it's just because it sounded muddy,
Mhm.
was John Lennon's Mind Games album. I never really cared for that album until the more recent reissues, remasters, that I go, oh, there is like some life in this. It doesn't feel like dead recordings. I don't know what to say about it. I mean, it's like they almost seem like, I mean, I think Lennon produced that album himself, but he just was not having a good day, I guess, because he was separated from Yoko and everything and just didn't take the same care. I don't want to go into that much, but it's like it wasn't until recent hands have taken it and it kind of brought it to life that I go, ah, this almost sounds as good as Walls and Bridges, which is my favorite Lennon album. Not quite
Yeah.
as good as maybe Imagine or something like that, but hey, it's like considering his circumstances at the time, it's not a dead on arrival album like I always considered, barring the title track. That's, so what did they do to make like a Becky's album or a Mind Games? Because I'm not, is it really pulling it apart from the original masters and just sonically improving it? What did they do?
My understanding, and I actually would like to talk to Michael about this. I know that thankfully Sire licensed this record almost immediately, John. It took us like a year to get BMG to admit that they actually owned the Strangers on the Train Left Bank album. That, story unto itself. But I believe Michael worked either from an album or something, a copy of not the master tapes, but something that was something of the final mix,
Mhm,
and basically kind of just brought everything up in terms of brightness, and just the clarity is really amazing. I mean, there's literally these harmony parts on this Becky's album that I had never really noticed. I kind of knew they were there, but I never really heard them until I heard this remastering. So
mhm,
a good mastering engineer will do wonders. I'll shout out the praises of my friend Dave Harris, he mastered the Circle album for me last year.
mhm,
He's done a number of things for me. Michael, who's a Grammy winner, does all of Omnivore Recordings' releases. Somebody who has an ear and says, "Okay, this is I will find the best ways to bring the sound up and make sure you hear everything with as much clarity as possible." So you would on the surface you think, oh, it doesn't make that much of a difference. It makes a world of difference.
yeah. Well, I've heard differences on the albums I said in a
Mhm.
few other cases, so I get what you mean without even hearing it.
Yeah.
Now on the demos themselves, the leftover songs, was there much tinkering or remastering on those? I mean, you can't really do much if they're sonically kind of, unless you're starting to use AI, artificial intelligence, or something. But
Which
eh,
we didn't do.
okay, okay,
But actually, how the demos, I'll tell you how the demos came to me was I had the first part of the demos through Jimmy McAllister, the guitarist. And he said, "Oh, I'll send you the whole thing." And then Jimmy passed away
mm-hmm,
suddenly in 2006. And a collector in England who collected a lot of the Left Bank demos and outtakes, his name was John Kennedy. He said, "Oh, here, I'll give them to you. Jimmy would want you to have these." So he sent me CD copies, which I always wanted physical copies of something, which I'm really thankful because it meant that working from CDs, that was the highest quality that we
hmm
could have gotten. If he just sent me MP3s, like a lot of people did back then, it wouldn't work. You really, if you're going to remaster something, you really try to work from like a WAV file or something larger
right,
just give you more options.
hmm
Um, so yeah, it's I got a little lost on your question again. I'm sorry about that. So
Well, just is how much remastering was done on the demos as opposed to the
the
actual
demos.
album. Yeah.
Well, and actually, to Michael Graves' credit, he mastered the album first, and then said, "Okay, I'm going to bring the demos up to the basically the sound is sonically as close to the studio album as basically it's a match as much as possible."
Okay.
So, which actually is a good way to work. Is
Yep.
it's supposed to saying, "Okay, thankfully the band did their own demos
Hmm.
in their own rehearsal space, and then later did do the studio session at Mercury. So but they sounded really good,
Hmm.
and you could hear, but it wasn't like, much as I love Guided by Voices and other bands from the '90s, the hi-fi was not something that was a concern for a lot of those recordings. Thankfully, that wasn't the case with the Beckies demos. So
Okay.
we really try to make the demos sound as good as studio album and vice versa.
Okay. And I don't know all the track listings. So are the demos completely unique songs, or are there demos of the songs that are on the album?
Almost entirely unique. I
Okay.
believe there's two versions of River Bayou
Okay.
on them, and I think there's maybe one other song of Gary's and Michael's that made it onto the final album, but pretty much the demos are a whole other set of songs written by Michael and Scott Trusty.
Very cool. Okay. Um, let's see. I had some other question here. Oh, Omnivore Records. I was just going to ask you about them.
Mhm.
So I have a few weird things that Omnivore's put out, like an Ernie Kovacs album and a few other
Mhm.
things. Are they kind of like a Rhino Records, or what is their story? I mean, why do they have interest in such things, and how do they make money on such things? What's this?
Well, that is the brainchild of Cheryl Pavelski, who is a
Hmm.
Grammy-winning producer herself, and I got to work with her on uh, the Wilco Yankee Hotel Foxtrot box set that won two Grammys a couple years ago, which was awesome.
Hmm.
And Cheryl, worked at Capitol. She oversaw the band reissues there and a lot of other things. I think she founded Omnivore as a way to get out records that she believed in, and they try to do is complete package throughout and make it something for those of us who really, you and I, we devour these records,
Yeah,
like, I do it every day if I could.
right.
And I think Omnivore is trying to be one of the top labels to, you know okay, you can't find this record anywhere else, we're going to do this record.
Yeah.
So that's what I like about working with Omnivore. I don't know if I could have convinced another label to put up with me through the Left Banke Odyssey and then this Becky's Odyssey, but thankfully they did.
Hmm. Okay. Because I always seem to see these labels come and go, but I guess, if you have somebody behind it that has strong beliefs, then it seems to
Mhm.
work, because
They held it out.
Rhino
Yeah,
did until the people left and formed Shout Factory. And then, you got those other ones like Wounded Bird and Real Gone. And I can't think of all the other ones, but, they sometimes make great efforts to put out obscure albums by major artists or just obscure albums, period. And then they just go away and you go, oh, I want a source for that,
and then you can't find those reissues. You can't find
Right.
those releases. So yeah, it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
But no, I think Omnivore is in it for the long haul. I will mention here too that several all my friends at Omnivore, Lee and Cheryl and Greg and everybody, and I thank you guys again for putting up with me all these years. If those of you out who are watching this would love to support Omnivore, please go to omnivorerecordings.com. As you may know, some of those folks were affected by the recent California wildfires. So any and all love you could share would be fantastic, and I hope you do.
Hmm. Hate to ask this because of that, but I mean, were there any sort of master tapes or anything that you know of that might have gotten destroyed or
Not
anything
not
during, yeah,
just more, just loss of personal belongings, but
right.
not to my understanding. No, I don't know of any master tapes that were lost.
Okay. Because I
At
know
least,
there's
on the board.
been major fires in the past with MGM and, the one with all uh, I forgot the major one. It's all the Dunhill recordings and everything went
Mhm.
away and stuff like that. It's like, what can
Issue
we
it on
do?
the board. That's not anything I know of or have
Yeah.
heard, but no, it's been, it's amazing how much that short window affected so much and will continue to affect a lot of people who work in the music business
Hmm.
for many years to come.
So what happens next with this? Obviously, it comes out February 28th. Uh, you said which ones we're going to go do interviews now? I forgot already.
It'll be Scott Trusty and Mark Abel.
Okay.
And I know we've got some press lined up coming pretty soon. And we've already gotten more interest on this record than we did on the Left Bank
Hmm.
reissue, which
That's
is
good.
very happy about.
Of course, if you
And
want to bring them by here, you can,
sorry
but
about that. Well, Scott
yeah,
and Mark and I have actually not done one of these yet. And
okay.
actually, all my contact with them the
Oh,
last
yeah.
year or two has all been email.
Okay.
So they don't even know what I sound like or look like, and maybe that's for the better. But
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. You haven't been in the
uh,
same room at least. So,
something
yeah.
that's something I would like to do. But yes, I will
Yeah.
bring it up to them at some point.
All
Yeah.
right. Very good. Let's see. Is there anything else we should know about the Beckies or why people should buy this upcoming CD reissue or just anything else you're working on? I'll give you a big
Well,
blanket question.
okay. Sure. Well, and there's definitely a lot of other things we can discuss. For me, with the Beckies, again, this is I'm glad that this bookend to this remarkable 10-year window of Michael Brown's life finally gets told correctly. It's like yes, the guy for 10 years was part of amazing music that went all the way back to Left Banke and then Montage and then Stories and then the Beckies. And then, was still writing songs up until when he passed away in 2015. And I'm also really proud that I could tell the story of the Beckies correctly. There was, had never been properly told. So, one, I'm glad I can finally set those things straight, but also let the music stand on its own. And I think it will now. So there is that. Um, in terms of future projects, I'm kind of deciding. I should mention that last year we released Revival by The Circle, their first album in 57 years, through Big Stir
Sounds so
Records.
weird.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, bigstirrecords.com. And I think it was one of the best sellers that Big Stir had last year. And I definitely am wanting to discuss doing something more. I don't know if the band's ready to do another record, but there is this thing where next year is the 60th anniversary of the first album
Hmm.
and the Beatles tour. So
Hmm.
we've talked a little bit about doing something kind of packaging a show around the set list that they would have done on the Beatles tour. And
That's
you
cool.
know, and Don and Mike are still hanging in there and doing great, and it's the whole band, and I'd love to see. So there's nothing to that.
Hmm.
Someone may, folk or two may have heard uh, other podcasts, but I have been working on the Chad and Jeremy archives,
Oh yeah.
and or it's nothing at length I can discuss right now, but it's been a really remarkable journey to go through the tapes and discover way more than even we knew to exist.
Hmm.
So this will be something of an ongoing process the next year or two. But again, stand by. It's going to be really, really cool.
Cool.
And I'm also finishing a new record for Phil Lee, a long-running singer-songwriter, and I have a couple other things that you know, I'm always, and I actually getting back to away from producing. I'd like to get back to writing a little more, and I'm considering doing a series of books this year that are my interviews, interviewing musicians over the last 30 years. So I have this notion I'm just going to drop them all online in one day and just like, here, we're done, you know,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
go off and do something else. But no, it's been a remarkable year or two to, you know,
Hmm.
again, dive deep as I can into this music that I love, and
Hmm.
hopefully I've done a good job in letting this music speak for itself.
Hmm. Couple more questions. So how's the photography doing? Any current photo shoots you've done on tour
Oh,
or anything like that? Or...
I mentioned Dane Donahue. You mentioned Dane Donahue earlier. I did photos for his new record. It's called
Oh, okay.
LA Rainbow. His first album in 47 years. I think it was something like that. First album since 1978, and it's on a label in Japan, but it's getting international press. And I drove to Ohio and shot it in one day and had everything to his record label edited and ready to go the next morning. I was like, I remember I used to work on records like this all the time. Back then, we were FedExing prints to each other.
Yeah.
Um, there's some things I'm working on I'd like to see come to fruition. I recently went through my Arthur Lee and Love archives because there's plans to release basically a final series of recordings that Arthur did. in the
Hmm.
2000s and releasing them with a full love band treatment.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping that some of my photos will be seen in that context pretty soon. Definitely be work back in Ohio with the Circle, doing some things. We did a couple dates with Pete Best last year. That was fun. I'd like to do that again. And then some things here around the region. And of course, if you're in the Charlotte area, I'm pretty much photographing everybody's event and more. I actually was in Shelby last night
Excuse
photographing
me.
Del McCoury. As for I work with the Earl Scruggs Center, which is, honors the work of and legacy of Earl Scruggs. So I actually met a few times, got to photograph several times.
Hmm.
So there's always one or 20 things going on around here. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I want to thank you again. I probably have thanked you 20 times, but it gives me a chance to plug my book of your Flo and Eddie pictures for Charles Roseday and my not just Happy Together book that, has plenty of photos from Henry Diltz and other photographers, but Daniel contributed at least a dozen or so Flo and Eddie photos from the aughts or something, I think 90s or aughts.
Aughts into the 2010s,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
actually got the last tour that Flo and Eddie did together on the
Oh,
Happy
okay.
Together tour. Yeah, and it's like it's my honor to be around all those great photographers. Henry is one of the reasons I do what I do,
That's cool.
and I'm proud that you know I actually got to, some will know that I got to photograph the monkeys at that show in Hollywood in 2016.
Hmm.
Part of the reason I was asked was that Henry wasn't available. So
Mm.
darn, if I got to be Henry Diltz for a day, for the monkeys,
You can be Henry Diltz for a day.
it's happened a couple of times when
That's
I
cool.
photographed Chen Jeremy's live album in 2010. They were like, "Well, Garrett Mankiewicz is our photographer, but today you'll do." It's like, okay, fair
Wow.
enough,
You'll
fair enough.
do.
Oh, why not? So if you're going to be somebody else for a day, be somebody that you whose work made you want to do this. So
Right.
yeah, I'll take that.
Very cool. Um, one last question, unless you have something else to say about the whole Becky's thing, but um, any, I mean, if you can't disclose who it is, that's fine, but any holy grails of music that you know about that you'd love to get your hands on to maybe produce or, release or something?
There's a couple things. There's a couple things. I will tell you, I cannot name the project, but there's something that hopefully I will be able to tell you about really soon
Okay.
that actually it's beyond 60s music. It's
Mm,
something else
okay.
that I'm helping facilitate a label deal right now.
Well, that's cool.
And when you find out, you'll go, "Oh yeah, that's Daniel. That's." And it was a recording I had heard rumors of, but didn't actually know to exist, or had actually heard until 2 weeks ago when I set up a Zoom call with this organization and a record label, and I couldn't talk for an hour because I was just, oh my god, it's real. This exists. Oh my
It's
god.
Carnival of Light. I knew it. I knew it. No, no,
So,
no. Anyway.
there's some others. I still
Yeah.
think we going back to the Left Bank. I think there's some
Yeah.
live recordings out there that
Yeah.
I remember. I'm still searching out. Somebody, posted on Facebook 10, 12 years ago on a Left Bank. Oh, I've got a recording of this show. It's like I'm still
Trying to find that
tracking
guy.
those down. Yeah,
Wow.
and there were a couple of studio sessions that I knew the Left Bank did that might have been in Tom Finn's possession, but I don't know. Again, I don't know who has access to those archives now or what happened to those. So, are there things out there, Holy Grails? Yes.
Oh, of course.
But I hope I hope I don't ever reach a point where it's like, there's nothing out there that I found everything.
Yeah.
Well, what's the fun in that?
Yeah.
There's still some things out there. I'm not, again, going back to, we'll have to do a separate show down the road about Chad and Jeremy when I can tell you
Yes,
more about
definitely.
that. But
Yeah.
it's amazing that Lily, you turn around and like, oh, what's this? It's like, yeah. So, you keep searching, you keep digging.
Yeah.
And again, if you care about this music or you care about the people, do it now. I, I've also been working the last few years on a book of an autobiography of Maurice Williams, who we lost last year. Stay, Little Darlin', this and that. And I have a book done, but it's something that his widow doesn't want to do anything with at this point. I'll respect that.
Yeah.
but I did a whole series of interviews of Maurice's friends and bandmates from
Yeah.
his early days and his earliest bandmate. I interviewed him 3 months ago, and he passed away last week.
Hmm.
So, regardless of where it ends up, document this stuff, document it
Right.
now. So, yeah.
Very cool. Okay. I guess at this point, give another plug for the upcoming Beckies, which will, by the time this airs, it'll have been out for a month or two, but you know, it doesn't matter. It comes out February 28th, but go ahead.
Yes. If you're just discovering about the Beckies, yes, it's the Beckies story. Good to know. Out on Omnivore Recordings on February 28th. Pick it up at your favorite record store or ask for your favorite record store to order it. You can find it online, and I really hope you will find that it is worthy of being, from my ears, it really is a worthy part of the Left Bank pantheon, if you will, Michael Brown. I also will again plug the Circle Revival, the first album in 57 years, out on Big Stir Records, bigstirrecords.com. And again, you can always find me at danielcoston.com, Daniel Coston on Facebook, Daniel Coston Photos on Instagram, and I'm always working on something. So, and also doing a load of podcasts
I
with
thought you said you did a load of pot. I was like, wow.
no, it's all
No.
caffeine at this point. So,
You wouldn't get
no,
anything done if that was the case. Anyway,
yeah, podcasts and lots of podcasts. So you can
podcast,
find
yeah.
me on this podcast. You can find me on the Plastic EP show, or we sometimes say the Plastic EP Melee, which is a fun series of shows that I do with Plastic,
Mhm.
and also my friend Ed Rising's podcast. And please come by and or find me and say hello.
Hello. And
Hello. Hello.
Um, let's see. I was going to say something, and now I totally lost my mind. But it's okay.
Well,
Um,
we can
oh, I
always
know.
just
By the
yeah.
time this does probably go up, because I've been doing fewer shows, and it may be Record Store Day. Which Record Store Day? The next one is on April 12th. So hopefully, if you're listening to this, you can get to a record store sooner than that date. But that might be a good date to find all these various recordings and. You never know. There might be a record store day release of some of these things too someday. So, you know,
Apparently, yeah,
like a single or something.
yeah, I would seriously love that. I know that we've had different discussions, like, okay, what else could we do,
Yeah.
depending on once we get past February 28th. So
Well,
I would love it.
yeah. If you
You know,
could, yeah, that might be a good one. Is a 7-inch record of the single that should have been by the Beckies. That's
and,
my request.
and also I would mention anybody, when you get to hear this Becky's record, let me know what you think should have been the single.
Mhm.
To my ears, something like "Right by Your Side" or "Fran" should have been the single. But I know that there's some other Becky's fans who are very adamant about some songs on the side too.
Mm.
So, comment below
Yeah.
or email me and let me know what are your favorite tracks. I'd love to hear that.
Okay, as soon as I get my hands on it, on February 28th, I will listen and I will come up with my own opinions. Okay, so,
Yeah,
all right. Well, thank you, Daniel Coston, for being my special guest again. Always welcome back. Love to talk about Chad and Jeremy or whatever projects you're working on next time. And I guess that wraps it up for another Fun Ideas podcast. This is your host, Mark Arnold, and we will see you next time.
look forward to it.